Thank you. So what I want to try and do is describe a similar challenge that we faced in trying to look at the breadth of these topics and distill a bit of certainty and a bit of some types of plans out of a range of discussions where, frankly, it's everywhere. I mean, Professor Floridi used the metaphor of the mangrove, but we who live on the Baltic Sea, we're used to brackish water that isn't really fresh water and isn't really salt water. You can drink it, although I don't really recommend it. But that's the world we're in now. There isn't a change today that isn't digital. So if you look around Brussels, I mean, you have DG Connect and you have the people who are dealing with digital policy in the classical narrow sense of the world, but there isn't a piece of EU legislation today, a piece of work being done by the lawmaker that isn't somehow about the digital. And so the intellectual challenge then is to maintain some kind of coherence of agenda as you do all of that. And I mean, we've been trying to do this as we put together the political plans for our EU presidency, which is a sort of short 6-month period where we get to draw attention to some of these questions. And it's been very difficult because at the end of the day, the program's meaningless. You can't generalize. You can't come up with clear narratives that at the same time really touch on everything. The one bit that we would like to offer to the debate in the next 6 months is to try and take some of the aspects of the economic agenda that Europe is working on and give them something a bit more permanent than simply a strategy, to sort of see if we can come up with something that is as enduring as the free movement of data, of labor, or of services or of goods in the single market that actually gives them some sticking power. So we'll be talking a lot about the free movement of data as a freedom of the EU in the next 6-7 months. Now that's often something that gets people riled up because they effectively assume that that means that all the questions of a well-regulated market go out the window. Now, when we talk about free movement of labor or goods or services in the EU, that certainly doesn't mean a neoliberal dream, and there are a lot of restrictions. So one of the questions we talk about when we talk about freedom and free movement when it comes to the digital world is also what the sensible restrictions are. And in particular, one of the questions we're going to have to deal with is something that, again, the liberals look at from the perspective, I don't mean the political group, as a positive thing, sort of free movement of data in terms of getting rid of localization restrictions is also a chance to deal with some of the difficult jurisdictional issues that we have. I mean, we don't have, for most administrative processes in an internet world, a single European jurisdiction, and sometimes that can be quite difficult. Now, if we look at these questions as a whole, the good news is that at the very highest level of government, the prime ministers, the heads of state and government, they really get that this is an issue. So if you talk to Mr. Macron, Ms. Merkel, they say all of these questions as a whole collectively are things they need to deal with and they need to grapple with. The challenge, however, is how to go from that very good high-level intent to actually getting government to work on a more practical level. And if you look at the Rome Declaration, which the heads of state and government adopted in Rome in March, every single one of the broad topics that they talked about impacts the themes that you've been talking about these last 2 days. So we talk about sustainability, the future of society. We talk about the security needs of European citizens. We talk about Europe's role on the global stage. And, of course, economic questions. Every one of these could equally well be rewritten into a treatise on what we do given the digital changes in the world today. However, the challenge then is to pull the prime ministers into saying something coherent on these topics and giving instructions to the rest of us, their ministers and the armies of civil servants they have below them, to make some kind of lemonade out of those lemons. On a very practical note, on the 29th of September, we have the privilege of hopefully gathering all of those heads of state and government for a day in Tallinn to try and get them to do exactly that. And I hope that you stay tuned on that question. Finally, I do want to give personally a bit of a digital native reaction to some of the questions that have come up here. I mean, first of all, if we're talking about fake news and the difficulties of the sort of the information sphere we have today, yes, Facebook has a role as a platform, but as long as we have the open internet, nothing stops you from building your own feed aggregator and pulling together your own picture. So while we bemoan the difficulties, we also need to be creating some practical bottom-up solutions. And in general, I mean, one of the frustrations when we have these discussions, and this is a personal frustration, is that if we spend too much time talking about the social justice aspects purely in the context of problematizing them and discussing the issues without putting forward fairly concrete proposals, those may be policy proposals, they may be technologies, they may be new services, then, then we're going to continue to discuss these while the rest of the world races ahead of us. If we talk about the gap between the haves and the have-nots, collectively we still are the haves. I mean, Europe is one of the wealthy parts of the world. My biggest fear is not that the gap between the haves of Europe and the have-nots of the rest of the world grows. My fear actually as a European is that gap becomes significantly smaller. So with that, what I can promise you for the next 6 months is that in every policy area that the EU deals with and that the Council of Ministers deal with, we'll be looking at some of the digital aspects of those policy discussions, everything from making taxation work and be more transparent by use of e-government solutions to better law enforcement and dealing with hate speech. I don't think that we'll have a single set of solutions from everything, but we can at least humbly offer a platform for those discussions. Thank you.